So thank you very much for joining us. My name is James Brady, and I am a committee member of British Pugwash, the organisation which seeks to provide a forum for scientifically informed discussion on nuclear weapons and a range of other existential risks to humanity. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Prof Sauer, Professor in International Politics at the Universiteit Antwerpen, Belgium. He's also a spokesman of the research group on international politics. Sauer's research domain is international security, and in particular proliferation, arms control, and disarmament of nuclear weapons. He has published 10 monographs and edited volumes and dozens of academic journal articles. He is on the board of Pax Christi Flanders and the International Institute for Peace in Vienna. He's also an active member of Pugwash. We are delighted you could join us this afternoon, Tom, and we're very much looking forward to your talk today on emerging technology and conventional weapons and their influence on nuclear deterrence. The format for today's session will be as follows. Professor Sauer will speak for approximately 25 minutes, and we will then open the floor to questions and discussions from the audience. I'd kindly ask that you check that your microphone is muted, and I will now hand over to Professor Sauer. Please, go ahead, Tom.
Hi, do you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, so welcome, and I feel honored that I can speak for the most active Pugwash section in the world, the British one. And I will talk about the impact, potentially revolutionary impact of new technologies and strategic conventional weapons on nuclear deterrence. So this is a logical starting point. So I start with the introduction, then the main arguments, and with the conclusion. And the starting point is as follows, and that's basically the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and more in particular Article 6, which says that the nuclear weapon states are supposed to negotiate a multilateral nuclear disarmament agreement for nuclear elimination. Now, as most of us are aware, the nuclear weapon states are not willing to eliminate their nuclear arsenals, and they use different arguments, including these two. First of all, there is the idea that nuclear deterrence is stabilizing, good for security, good for peace. This is the classic argument in favor of nuclear weapons. And another argument is that there is no alternative for nuclear deterrence. That is what we can hear. Now, what I also believe is that I believe in the feasibility to reach a world without nuclear weapons will also increase the desirability. There's the link between the feasibility and the desirability. So I will talk today about emerging disruptive technologies and weapon systems. Not all of them. There are more than the ones that I will talk about. I will mostly focus on strategic conventional missiles, including hypersonic missiles. Also a little bit of AI and cyber. And I've also written a paper on this, and that's published by the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium in December 2024. And in that paper, I do not refer to autonomous weapons, space weapons, and drones. So just this caveat to start with. Now, what are the characteristics of these modern strategic conventional missiles? What is relatively new? That they are accurate, more accurate than before, due to new technology, precision guidance, remote sensing, thanks to satellite, GPS. They are speedy. That's maybe less new, but still. Maneuverable, that's certainly new. There are only a few types of ICBMs that are maneuverable. And on top of that, the warheads are also more destructive than before and better against, for instance, hard targets. So as a result of these characteristics, this new technology, these missiles are becoming more useful with conventional warheads, just with conventional warheads, much more than before was the case. So I make three arguments in this paper. First of all, these new technologies, emerging and disruptive technologies like AI and cyber, but also these hypersonics, are destabilizing for nuclear deterrence. There is more or less a consensus in the literature on this, but I will go through that immediately. Secondly, in my view, it's easier to eliminate nuclear weapons than to eliminate these new technologies and these new conventional missiles like hypersonics. And last but not least, and that is maybe the most original part of my paper and my talk of today, is that some of these new weapon systems, and more in particular the hypersonics and modern conventional missiles, can replace nuclear weapons as they are more credible as a deterrent, because they're not so catastrophic when used, and therefore also more usable. In a world, and that's very important to understand, I'm talking about a world then without nuclear weapons. And that's not for the short term or the medium term, but for the longer term, of course, we can debate how long that period should be. So the first argument, main argument, is that nuclear weapons are becoming more vulnerable due to these new technologies. Because of their characteristics, they facilitate attacking nuclear forces themselves, but also the command and control systems of these nuclear forces and early warning systems of the enemy. There's a lot of literature. You see the literature mentioned on the slide. Now, another element of this is that the nuclear conventional entanglement problem, which already existed, worsens due to this technology. And what does that mean? Is the potential misperception of the nature of the attack by a missile. You cannot see immediately whether there's a nuclear or a conventional warhead on top of the missile. Possibly leading to inadvertent escalation. That's the risk written by James Acton already a couple of years ago. And then, and that's also very interesting and potentially revolutionary, is that due to big data and AI, submarines, which are nowadays very important for second strike capability for the nuclear weapon states, they may become visible and vulnerable in the future due to this big data, AI, more sensors in the oceans and so on. And the same applies for mobile ICMs. So if that's the case, now there's less consensus on this last element in the literature. It's more controversial. But if that happens, then the nuclear weapon states have a huge problem. So why is it a problem? This growing vulnerability of nuclear weapons due to these new systems will require those nuclear weapon states to put their nuclear weapons on higher alert, which may then lead to preemptive use or lose use, all of which is destabilizing and has been described in the literature. And that's just the opposite of the theory of nuclear deterrence, which says that nuclear weapons are stabilizing and good for security and peace. So the nuclear weapon states have a problem. Now, in principle, in theory, 4 possible solutions are imaginable. The first one is banning the new systems, like hypersonics, like AI, like cyber. Now, that is, of course, very unlikely because they also are used for civilian purposes. And it's not easy to make a difference between civilian and military. A second possibility, second option to resolve the problem is limiting the new systems and the technology, but still living with the new technology and hypersonics, and also keeping the current nuclear deterrence doctrines, mostly by denial, maximum deterrence, which is destabilizing and dangerous. I just have shown this in the first part of my presentation, and the entanglement between conventional nuclear remains. Another solution would be to move from nuclear deterrence by denial, maximum deterrence, to deterrence by punishment, nuclear deterrence by punishment, minimum deterrence, which does not require higher alert levels, and keep the new technologies. But that doesn't resolve the issue. It's still destabilizing and dangerous. especially with respect to the submarines. With deterrence by punishment, a minimum deterrent, you need less nuclear weapons, and you will probably rely more on the submarines. So if due to AI and big data, these submarines can become visible, this option is also not a good solution. So if you look to the 3-4 options, I think the last one is the best. It's also applied by the NPT and the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that we should dismantle the nuclear weapons and gradually replace them with modern strategic conventional missiles. I believe that, and that's the most original part of the paper, as I already said, some of these new systems can help us creating an alternative for nuclear deterrence in the form of conventional deterrence. So no nuclear brinkmanship anymore. The big danger of nuclear annihilation disappears, and we remain, we keep the conventional missiles. So we are not talking about any conventional. These are strategic conventional weapons, advanced conventional weapon systems designed and deployed to accomplish strategic functions. So they can be used for warfighting, but also for deterrence. This becomes feasible because of the new technology, the revolution in military affairs, as already said, more accurate, speedy missiles, maneuverable also, the prompt global strike ID by Bush Jr., and Obama later on, and the more destructive conventional bombs. Now I'm going to show you a couple of quotes by other experts who have written in the past about this idea, not always going as far as I do, but you will see that they go in that direction. And the first one is the famous Samuel Huntington, already in 83, 84, in the Peace of International Security, he wrote, "Effective retaliation means credible retaliation." And in today's world, credible retaliation means conventional retaliation, already in the 80s. Here you have Paul Nitze, a hawk, a nuclear hawk in the Cold War, one of these more important ambassadors dealing with arms control, nuclear arms control. He wrote in his 90s, in the 90s, smart conventional weapons, I quote, are safer, cause less collateral damage, and cause less threat of causing escalation, therefore offering greater flexibility for use in situations where nuclear weapons would be politically or militarily impractical. End of quote. Here we have Barry Watts, as a former US DoD Director of Program Analysis and Evaluation at the Pentagon, in 2005, saying, and I quote, "growing ability of accurate non-nuclear munitions to achieve military effects comparable to nuclear weapons without the collateral damage of nuclear employment." So having the advantages of nuclear deterrence and not the disadvantages. Here we have two other nuclear hawks, academics from the United States, Keir Lieber and Darrell Press, in their piece in International Security in 2017. And I quote, "changes in technology and are eroding the foundation of nuclear deterrence." End of quote. And here you have more recent quote by one of the CIPRI researchers, Tuti Erasto, from Finland, and she writes, and I quote, "precision strike weapons have the potential to substitute nuclear weapons as a more credible and less risky source of deterrence against conventional aggression." End of quote. Now, these are all, you can say, retired or non-governmental experts, but also in governmental and parliamentary documents, and I list them here. You can see that the idea of making conventional deterrence more important and nuclear deterrence less important is already the case. And I refer, for instance, to the Nuclear Posture Review by Obama, but also the Russian military doctrine in 2014, and the recent Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture in the United States, as well as a recent State Department report. I will quote one or two of these as well. This is the US Bipartisan National Defense Panel in the 1990s. And I quote, the conventionally armed ICBMs could provide a supplement or alternative to nuclear arsenals of the Cold War, end of quote. And the last quote is that State Department report from October 2023, and I quote again, over the long term, one way to reduce the demand for nuclear weapons would be to broaden the defense and deterrence portfolio, including by developing more advanced conventional means, such as advances in precision, in order to provide the President with more decision-making space and effective strategic options in the event of an existential threat or nuclear coercion against the United States or one of our allies. And this is, of course, not asking for replacing, but making at least the role of conventional deterrence larger than before. And here you have a very recent quote by Putin. After having used the Oreshnik missile, you remember in November, December of last year, this intermediate range missile, conventional, maybe meant for nuclear. And he said, what we need now is not to improve the nuclear doctrine, but the Oreshnik, because enough of these weapon systems puts us on the verge of virtually eliminating the need to employ nuclear weapons, end of quote. Conclusion, is that this technological argument may help convince the many skeptics of a nuclear weapons-free world. I repeat, the new technology emerging in disruptive technology and weapon systems, they are destabilizing for nuclear deterrence. There is more or less a consensus in the literature on this. So that's a problem for the nuclear weapon states. And in my paper, I argue that the solution, the most easy solution, is modern conventional weapons. Part of these new weapon systems, like hypersonics, they are also better deterrent because more credible, because more usable. A few caveats to conclude. Ultimately, what is of course needed is more than technology, is political will. Which requires on its turn the acceptance of the idea, first of all by experts like you, and then by politicians, that nuclear deterrence could and should be replaced by an alternative. As long as there's no willingness, it will not happen. As long as they see that it's not desirable, of course, they will not find solutions to make it feasible. And this paper is a contribution to make it more feasible and therefore more desirable. And to make it very clear, I'm talking about a nuclear weapons-free world and an alternative for nuclear deterrence in a nuclear weapons-free world. I'm not talking about the period going from 2025 to a world without nuclear weapons. That's for another paper and for another presentation. Okay, that's it. I'm finish my presentation. I will stop my sharing, and then you can ask questions or give comments.
Thank you so much, Tom. That is a really interesting and provocative paper, and I think poses a lot of challenges for us in the non-proliferation world, who may now face some kind of interesting challenges in what we advocate for going forward. I'm going to open the floor to any questions from our audience. I'd ask, if you have a question for Tom, would you mind please raising your hand and I'll come to you. So Jan, I can see your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Greetings from the Netherlands. Tom Sauer, thank you for your very interesting introduction. We know each other quite well, so you will guess what my question would be. That is, of course, I concur with your conclusion that the best solution would be to swap nuclear deterrence for conventional deterrence by eliminating nuclear weapons completely, as has been promised by almost everybody in Article 6 of the NPT. But my quite obvious question to you would be, how would we be able to arrive at that ideal situation? What kind of interim steps would we need? I'm now passing a little bit quickly the very dire international situation. But even if we would assume a somewhat better international situation, what kind of interim steps would we need on the way to complete elimination of nuclear weapons? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I might just ask that we take maybe two further questions, and we come through those questions just for the sake of managing to get through as many questions as possible. Timothy, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, James, and thank you, Tom, for that really interesting presentation. I've got a couple of questions, if you don't mind. So for nuclear weapon states, do you think that reducing the reliance on nuclear weapons and instead putting greater emphasis on conventional capabilities, do you think that could potentially, though, lower the threshold and increase the probability for conflict because the political cost of using those conventional weapons would be lower? Also, second, I thought your points around the sort of increased precision strike capabilities were very interesting, but many of these systems have limited ranges, and so do their platforms. And many of them, the strategic forces, both in Russia, China, the United States, are very much deep in their interiors. So my question really is, do you think that improved conventional precision strike capabilities affect nuclear forces equally across all three domains, or do you think that some are less vulnerable than others? I'm thinking especially around sort of sea-based forces, like many of the nuclear weapon states have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. And Shefran, please go ahead, and then we'll return to Tom for his response.
Yeah, thanks to Tom Sauer for this thought-provoking paper. We had some discussion earlier, and the one issue is, of course, it sounds like a promising idea to replace nuclear deterrence by conventional deterrence and then abolish all nuclear weapons, which I have been favoring since a long time anyway. But this all relies on the condition that conventional deterrence works and can prevent war. And there is the argument also made here that conventional deterrence can lower the threshold of war. As we see, for instance, between Ukraine and Russia, it's a conventional war yet with missiles. And if one side is going to lose, then they might be prompted to use nuclear weapons or threaten nuclear weapons. And then the question is, in a war situation, whether they can prevent the use of nuclear weapons in a situation when they're going to lose. And if that also makes a nuclear war more likely. Of course, if nuclear weapons have been abolished, then this is not possible, but countries know this before and may keep nuclear weapons as a weapon of last resort in case they are losing. And this applies, of course, to all nuclear weapon states and all others who are aiming to become nuclear weapons. So my question is, couldn't conventional deterrence increase the risk of nuclear deterrence rather than lowering it?
Mhm.
Thanks so much. Tom, please go ahead.
Yeah, already many questions, critical questions. Very good. Jan, you asked a question about the interim period. I just finished my talk saying this paper is not about the interim period. So, but I can give you the short answer that, of course, the goal is to, with this writing this paper, is propose a new idea. That it should be discussed by the epistemic community, the arms control community, non-proliferation community, disarmament community, experts, and then be socialized into the political domain, political world, and that this idea is more and more accepted, so that more and more experts in the nuclear weapon states and politicians start seriously working on a nuclear weapons-free world, which is not the case nowadays. It's not the case. Nobody is doing it. Of course, you can point out the geostrategic situation of today, which is, of course, not very good, as everybody knows. But I think it's easy to predict that the war in Ukraine will come to an end at a certain moment, maybe sooner than later, thanks to Trump. I'm not a big believer in Trump, but at least he will try, more than the previous American president. And I'm rather optimistic that there is a chance that he will be able to make at least a ceasefire, have a ceasefire, and then later on maybe a peace agreement. Both camps are tired of fighting, certainly the Ukrainians, but in my view, also the Russian population is tired of this war. Putin has problems with his war economy. He cannot sustain that forever. And Putin knows this. So he also has an interest to come to the negotiation table and try to come to an end to this war. And then, like after any war, major war, there are opportunities for not only for going back to the status ante like before the war, but doing it better than before the war. Just like after the First World War, and especially after the Second World War, when we created the United Nations, a collective security system. So there are opportunities when this war ends, also for arms control, strategic arms control, tactical arms control, and that's what we will need for going in the direction of global zero. Ideally multilaterally, but maybe first bilaterally again, then bringing in China, France, and England, and the other de facto nuclear armed states. And it has to be multilateral. I'm not asking for unilateral nuclear disarmament. And if these nuclear weapon states know that there's an alternative, I think that becomes then also a more feasible option. Good. For Tim, there's a classical counter argument that if you do away with nuclear weapons, you will see more wars in the future. We don't know. That's, of course, the first answer. I see in this world, with a lot of nuclear weapons, already a lot of major wars, like the one in Ukraine, Russia. So this nuclear weapons world does not deliver the promises that the theory promises, nuclear deterrence theory. The nuclear deterrence theory promises stability, security, and peace. I see now in Ukraine, Russia, very destabilizing situation, insecurity, and war. It's the opposite of what the nuclear deterrence theory promises. And then you can argue that Ukraine had no nuclear weapons and so on and so on. We can go in that that debate later on. But another answer to your counter argument is, of course, in the end, we maybe have to live with more smaller weapon wars with conventional weapons, indeed, than nowadays is the case. But at least the possibility of nuclear annihilation has gone. So there's a cost benefit. Either you prefer always living with the risk of nuclear annihilation, that nobody survives, and less conventional wars, or a bit more conventional wars and no risk of the end of the world. So it's up to us to decide. I'm not saying that this is the ideal world. I think it's a better world than the world we are living in. The second question I didn't get, but then I will answer the question by Jurgen. Was also about the credibility of conventional deterrence, if I understood it well. And here again, look to what's happening today and the talk in Europe and in NATO to build up the defense and the defense expenditures for what? Not for nuclear weapons. They want conventional weapons. Apparently, these nuclear weapons are not very relevant. If nuclear weapons are really delivering as the theory posits, then we don't need conventional weapons. Because nuclear deterrence is good for stability, security, and peace. But that's not what's happening. Most of the money nowadays is going to conventional weapons. And we still keep the nuclear weapons because they always have been here. We forgot about them. But maybe John Muller is right, saying that nuclear weapons are basically irrelevant. We don't know. At least I think the nuclear weapon states exaggerate the usefulness of nuclear weapons. Maybe we exaggerate on the opposite side, but we simply do not know to what extent nuclear deterrence has worked and can work. We should be intellectually honest on this. And yeah, I've written a piece in the Journal of Peace and Nuclear Disarmament last year about the role of nuclear weapons in the war in Ukraine. So have a look at that piece. And then your second and last question, Jürgen, was about a nuclear weapons-free world and the risk of then building nuclear weapons again, if I understood you well. Here, my answer is that we should, of course, delegitimize nuclear weapons, gradually dismantle them, and then we are close to zero. We have to think very hard how to go to zero. And many of us in Bugwash community have already thought and written about this for decades. In my view, I think there are 5 conditions that are needed to go then to the last step and go to zero. Multilateral, of course. The first one is universality. All nuclear weapon states have to agree. Currently, the 9 nuclear weapon states. If one of them says no, we cannot do it. But of course, if China, Russia, and the United States is willing to go to zero, Russia and China or the United States will also be more interested in going to zero, of course. Probably the biggest or the most difficult cases are Israel and North Korea. But we have to convince them in one way or another as well. That's the first condition. The second condition for going to zero is verification. Yeah, just like chemical weapons, by the Chemical Weapons Convention, intrusive verification system should be worked out. We need that in advance. A third condition is a sanction regime for those who cheat, and for those who think about cheating, they should know in advance what the sanctions are. A fourth condition is a change in the UN Security Council constellation. India will never give up its nuclear weapons as long as it does not get a seat, a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. This UN Security Council constellation should be adapted anyhow, and this is a good occasion for doing it. And last but not least, we have to change the global collective security regime as it exists nowadays in the United Nations and beyond, which means the rules about war and peace. As long as the United States can intervene whenever and wherever it wants in the world, North Korea will not give up its nuclear weapons. So these doctrines should be thrown in the dustbin. There should be a better collective security regime, including also conventional arms control. So if these 5 realistic conditions are fulfilled, I think we can go to zero. And we do not need a world without conflicts. We do not need a world full of democracies. We do not need a world without nuclear energy. These are other conditions that do not have to be fulfilled, in my view. Only these 5 are crucial. But that's another discussion, for another paper and for another presentation.
Can I give a very short response?
We do have a couple of hands raised already, so if we have time, we can come back. Is that okay?
No problem.
Okay, thank you. Julian, please go ahead. Your question.
Hi, thank you so much, Tom. Tom, I broadly agree with your argument, and I'm very happy that in the answer you also couched it more in terms of creating more structures for peaceful resolution of disputes. But I would caution that you perpetuate an argument that new technologies are necessarily so precise. I think we should really just, they are more precise than nuclear weapons, and relative to nuclear weapons, we expect less collateral damage. But there's a lot of authors that question, especially when AI is introduced, people like Lucy Zuckman, Jonathan Est, who. And if we look at Gaza, I mean, 90% of homes are destroyed. 70% of people killed are women and children. Not to say, that the men killed are not civilians. So we have to question this idea that these new technologies are so precise. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Caroline, please go ahead.
Yes, I mean, I agree with the previous speaker as well, because I mean, if you look at what's happening in the Middle East, it's just indiscriminate destruction, murder of tens of thousands of civilians, most of them being women and children. So, there are some very bad actors on the scene. What makes you trust that if there was this nuclear disarmament, that those, and I can think of one or two there in the Middle East, that those would actually stick to it? Or would they say, right, everyone else has given up their nuclear weapons, now we can carry on doing what we want, because they're doing what they want anyway. The ICC and the UN are both completely toothless, plus ceasefires are being broken all the time. So why do you trust that these countries are going to be honest and going to stick to it?
Thank you very much, Caroline. And Ian, please.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Tom. A really interesting, very pithy presentation, and I encourage you to keep on thinking and working in that direction. One thing that nothing has been said about is a kind of economic considerations. Through the Cold War, Western powers sought to use tactical nuclear weapons as a means of countering the massive conventional forces that the Soviet Union could muster. So it was seen as a more economic means of defense. And the same, to a degree, also applies to North Korea and Israel. They see this as not so much a quick and easy means of securing their continuity, but certainly a very effective way of doing it, and a cost which was not going to bankrupt the state. So I think this is another aspect of the question that probably needs to be thrown into the pot for consideration, and I invite you to do that. Thanks again.
I think as well we could probably take Yuri's question at this point. Is that all right? Yuri, if you'd like to go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you for brilliant presentation. And my question, which I wrote in chat, did anyone make an argument convincing enough for general public, and especially going from scientists, which adds ability to convince people that the nuclear weapons are actually not adding any value to security at all, but are simply reduction ad absurdum for a whole idea of peace through strength, armaments, ability to harm, to kill, to destroy, and this self-destruction of nuclear war as a means of security looks like just total demonstration that this approach is not working.
Respond to these, Tom. Thank you very much, Yuri. Would you like to respond at this point, please?
Yeah, thanks again for all the questions, and I will combine the first two by Jolien and Caroline. They are making the argument, if I understood well, that I should be careful to praise these conventional weapons because they can make a lot of harm as well. I'm not denying that. I mean, it's clear for everybody. If you look to Gaza, that's a catastrophe. It's a genocide, as Amnesty International said. If Amnesty International can say that, I will repeat it. So that has always been the case, and that will remain the case. So there's a continuity on this. There's no change. The only thing that I'm asking is to take away the nuclear weapons out of the picture. And you can even argue that if there are some crazy people around killing 40,000 children, women, and men, that these same politicians in the end may at a certain moment in time also think about using a nuclear weapon. And some of them in Israel has said explicitly to use a nuclear weapon on Gaza. And the one in Russia nowadays is threatening to use a nuclear weapon on Ukraine, more than once. And I believe, and I'm not the only one, and many probably in this room as well, that this is a serious risk that we cannot underestimate, especially and only if Russia will lose. So if Ukraine, thanks to the Western world, would be able to push Putin out of Ukraine, which is very unlikely for the moment, but you never know, then this guy is not going to walk back to his Kremlin and said, sorry, I made a mistake. That's not what's going to happen. He's 72 years old. He put all his political capital in this war. He is not going to lose this war. He's very mad. And he has reasons to be mad, even from a realist point of view. I'm not legitimizing what he did. What he did is completely illegal, immoral, and illegitimate. But from a realist perspective, many realists have predicted this war. This war could have been prevented. And so if Ukraine is able to push Russia out, which is at first sight, of course, very legitimate and fair. But if that is going to happen, I predict that there's a real risk that Putin and Russia will use a tactical nuclear weapon on Ukraine. And the consequence of that will be that Mr. Scholz or his successor will immediately stop giving weapons to Ukraine. And the same applies to the rest of Europe. We will all be very afraid. This use of a tactical nuclear weapon will go viral, as any other TikTok movie has gone around in the world. And this will make a difference. That's my prediction. And especially Putin knows what Biden has already said. I'm not going to use a nuclear weapon if Putin is going to use a nuclear weapon. That's basically what Biden has said. And that's the difference between a democracy and an autocracy. Now, Putin also reads the newspapers, so that he will have even more incentives to use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. But all this on the condition that he and Russia will lose, and that's not the case for the moment. But my point is, for Jolien and Caroline, there are politicians in the world that do not care very much about using force with conventional weapons, but also with nuclear weapons. It's not because they have not been used for 80 years that they cannot be used again in the future, nuclear weapons. Then for Jan, the role of the economy. Yeah, I think it's a myth that nuclear weapons are cheap. There has been a famous study by Swartz in the United States already 15 or 20 years ago. He calculated how much it has costed the United States to build all these nuclear weapons. It was, I believe, $5 trillion. That's not cheap. France and the UK are spending maybe 10% of their, or even more of their defense budgets on nuclear. That's a lot of money for these countries. And they're useless, basically, at least in my view, and in John Muller's view. So, and in the end, conventional missiles are not more expensive than nuclear missiles. These missiles are the same. You only put another warhead on top of it. So it's not an economic issue, in my view. And then the last question by Yuri. I don't know whether I've got your point, but if your point was that public opinion is wiser than the elite on nuclear weapons, and less in favor of nuclear weapons than the elite, I'm not sure. Then I would refer you to the academic articles by Scott Sagan on the role of public opinion. And he shows via surveys that a lot of people are in favor of using nuclear weapons against a state like Iran, even if millions of Iranians would die. And just a last thing about public opinion, the last president who was elected in the United States got many votes, more than the opponent.
I see your hand raised, Paul. Just before I come to you, I'm going to turn to the questions we received in the chat. So there's a question here from Okopi. The limits to conventional deterrence is that some states are more conventionally powerful than others. States such as Russia, China, and Pakistan have sought nuclear weapons to balance against conventionally superior foes. In this sense, will strategic conventional deterrence disproportionately benefit conventionally superior states? So good question there from Okopi. There's also another point being raised here by Nobuyasu. Just 1 second while I bring it up. It's a point on the Ukrainian war. It's proving the limited nuclear deterrence. It's not making Russia win the conventional war, but it is preventing the Western intervention so far. In a way, it's proving the surprisingly powerful utility of such conventional weapons as a variety of drones. So an interesting point there from Noibli Asu. If you would like to respond to it in due course, I'm going to turn to Paul. Paul, please go ahead.
Better unmute first. Thanks, James. And Tom. I've been involved in this game long enough to know that arguments around global security and collective interest don't play very well with most of the leaderships that we're trying to influence. And that's particularly so today, although I would say that the election of Donald Trump is simply the election of a lying, philandering criminal who's just exposing in a sort of truth way what's always been there in the US imperial system. So just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, it's not particularly pro the Trump administration or indeed any nuclear weapon state, but they are, in my view, motivated by a number of things, including global power and the assumption that you dominate or be dominated. There are arguments around deterrence. I think they're less important in terms of what actually influences these people's perception, but nevertheless, one does have to engage in arguments around deterrence. Deterrence is not objective, it's about perceptions. Nuclear deterrence works because people believe it works, not because it actually works necessarily, or there's a false illusion around objectivity here. It's about perception. It's like money. Money has no value unless people think it has value, and then it has value. One thing we rarely talk about in situations like this is corruption and the influence of corruption. Anybody visiting Washington, D.C., as I did on many occasions when I was director of BASIC, would see just the level of money that goes in by the arms companies, the prime contractors, into paying for thousands and thousands of people whose only job it is to convince the people with purse strings to spend money on this thing. I'm in the middle of a fascinating book called Unit X, How the Pentagon and Silicon Valley are Transforming the Future of War. One of the very early points he makes is that you wouldn't have Microsoft building an aircraft carrier but you have Lockheed and Boeing building systems that are utterly dependent on digital systems, which are 30 or 40 years old, completely out of date. And the reason for that is because they're corrupt and they lack innovation. And the argument of the book is written by techno people who believe that Silicon Valley is the future of military. And that means non-nuclear. It means more than conventional weapons. It means all sorts of very novel and bizarre technologies to our mind, but in 10, 15, 20 years' time, the future of warfare will look very different. And the only reason why we don't know about it is because we're not in it ourselves, in that innovative space. Now, in that situation, we already know that these tech people are already corrupt. This is a relatively new thing, but anybody who watched Donald Trump's coronation would see the level of corruption there is, and that they too will become less than innovative because they will fall into the same trap as the prime military contractors. So it's a fascinating moment, and I think nuclear weapons do have their life shelf in this situation, but probably not for any of the reasons that we've been talking about. And it will have to do with the nature of power within each of these institutions, how shocks to the system. I mean, we've seen a shock to the system this week that is huge with the arrival of this relatively cheap AI system from China, which demonstrates how the biggest, most wealthy institutions on the planet have invested in an assumption which is now looking very shaky, which is that you just throw computing power at the problem and that will come up with a solution. And and that is the level of corruption. So I'll just finish on the idea that change is massive, that with climate change and the other collapse of systems that we are witnessing around us, nuclear weapons play an important role, but they're not defining until they get used. And that's when the problem is.
Thanks very much, Paul. Tom, I'm going to hand back to you in a moment. We're just coming up very close to the hour. So please go ahead with your responses. And I think we might take this set of questions and comments as our final set. So I'll hand over to you for your responses to these questions. There's also maybe some questions in the chat that we might be able to get to before we close out for the hour. But Tom, please go ahead.
Yeah, on the first question, I can be short. Of course, nowadays, in a world with nuclear weapons, some nuclear weapon states have a lot of conventional weapons, are more advanced. And for instance, for hypersonics, Russia and China are probably more advanced than the United States at this moment. But I'm not talking about this world. I'm talking about a world without nuclear weapons. That will be in 2045, 2050, realistically speaking, hopefully before. But so those who are behind in the conventional arms race, they can still make more conventional weapons. That said, I think I'm not pleading for a new arms race. We need also arms control in the non-nuclear world. Secondly, on Ukraine, I don't know whether I've got to the point, but if the point is that the Russian nuclear weapons prevented NATO to intervene with boots on the ground, I mean, I've written about that in my piece in the Journal of Peace and Nuclear Disarmament. We don't know. We don't know. Even if in a non-nuclear world, maybe NATO would not have intervened in this war. Because we don't want to fight the Russians. I mean, not the Belgians, not the Germans, not the French. And regardless of the nuclear weapons, Russia is a big power, regional power, with conventional weapons as well. So we simply do not know why we haven't intervened. Is it due to nuclear weapons? Is it due to other factors? We should be intellectually honest about this. And in a world without nuclear weapons, there's no difference between these states anymore. Then there's, again, equality. And that's more sustainable than the current regime, which is very discriminatory and not sustainable. And with Jolien, we have written a couple of pieces about the future of the NPT. And for those who do not want to change the whole situation and delegitimize nuclear weapons, we predict that in the end the NPT will crumble, and then we end up with a kind of nuclear anarchy. And then, what then? Then we have to invent a new treaty, and maybe then we end up with a nuclear weapons convention, just like the biological and chemical. Maybe we need that. But what I propose is a constructive alternative. Lastly, on Paul, of course, I'm not denying the role of power. In the war in Ukraine, I really follow John Mersheimer's point. So we need to understand and see the world also through realist glasses, not only through realism, but also through realist glasses. But I don't think that these nuclear weapon states need nuclear weapons for power. They need to be secure, and some of them do not need nuclear weapons for their security. Some of them, of course, used it for prestige, but as you showed us, there are new technologies coming up, and that will be the prestige element for the future. Those countries with AI and all these new elements, they will find themselves as the #1 in the world, and nuclear weapons are old stuff. Last point on Trump. We simply do this is a very unpredictable man, as everybody knows. He promised not to start new wars, and he did so in the previous 4 years when he was president. He didn't start wars. He tried to end wars. He did already end the Gaza war. I'm not saying that it will hold, but it's already better than what Biden did. And apparently he's talking about nuclear arms control recently. With Russia and even China. The guy loves Ronald Reagan. You know Ronald Reagan. He started as a hawk, but then in the second term he completely changed. And the guy and Reagan and Trump are probably very much afraid of nuclear weapons. But I'm not a psychologist. That's for another presentation. I turn over to James.
Tom, thank you so much. Can I just say on behalf of all of our members and the other executive committee members, just how interesting and enriching the discussion and your presentation was today. So thank you very much. I want to also thank everybody who posted your questions in the chat and asked questions as well today. I think we had an extremely useful hour. I would also like to highlight that anybody who's joined this session is very welcome to join British Bugwash as a member, and we have a link in the chat if you're looking for it. And I just want to say thank you very much to everyone for a really useful and interesting hour today. And again, thank you very much, Professor Sauer. So thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you join us again in the future. Thanks all.
Bye.
Thank you very much.